Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to return a word to you on this matter. If it is so that our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, then he'll deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, these poor fellas were in a trap. Remember, he built this big golden image, and when they blew all the trumpets and they sounded all the musical instruments, everybody was supposed to stop and bow down and kneel. We're assuming Daniel didn't do it either, but Daniel's not in our particular story. And so these three fellas, these three Jews, refused to bend. There used to be a sermon that preachers would preach, and it was said, would not bend, would not bow, and would not burn. Okay? And so this is where we're at. These are the fellas. You see everybody else bowing down around them. Everybody else is worshiping the image. It's pretty easy to spot you when you're the only people standing up. Everybody else is bowing down toward the image. Three Jewish boys or men standing up. Everybody takes a peek, and hey, you didn't bow down. No, I don't bow down to false gods. They're arrested. They're brought before the king. And the king says, listen, maybe you didn't understand. Here's what we'll do. I'll have them blow the horns one more time, and you can bow down right here in front of me. They said, you can blow the horn all you want. We're not going to do it. But if you don't, I'm going to throw you in that fiery furnace. Listen, God might save us. He can. But then again, he might not. If he does or he doesn't, that's in his hand. I'm still not going to bow down to you. Wow. That's a lot of courage. Because you're looking at the most powerful man in the world who has no problem with throwing people in a fire. Babylonians were pretty mean. They were probably just a little bit more mean than the Assyrians. And when the Assyrians came in and when they conquered you, like the Jews that they conquered before, I should say the Israel, the 10 northern tribes, the kings would put big hooks in their captives' faces and drag them along their horses. If you didn't keep up with his horse and you fell, you were pulled by hooks in your face along behind his. They had no problem. These were mean. The way you got promotion in these ancient armies was they would count the skulls outside, or the heads outside your tent. You got more heads, you get a promotion, young lady. Okay. Sorry, Ella, you need a few more to make corporal. You know, she's cheating. So these ancient people were not nice. You know, a couple of years ago, you could turn on the internet and see how not nice they were today. When they captured those Americans or captured those Jewish people, and the cruelty, the sawing off of the head, same blood flows through them. These are the same people that we're dealing with today, that Daniel had to deal with. This was the history of that part of the world, a very, very cruel and bloody history. So the decision not to bow was massive. You literally took your life in your hand, because the king said, anybody who doesn't, this is what I will do to you. And he was very specific about your death. And everybody could see the big old fiery furnace out there and knew that that's where they were going. So everybody bows down. I don't know how many Jews don't. We're not really told. Maybe these three are pictures of a bunch of Jews that refused. Because Jews eventually are given an exception. And it's really strange. Most of the empires that conquered the Jews always made the exception for them that they didn't have to worship their gods. One of the things about Nebuchadnezzar, as he learns pretty early on, is to let people have their own religion. He learns it right after this. Doesn't work to try to force people into it. It's much easier to conquer a people if they can maintain their religion and a little bit of their own history. And then he just would sort of mingle them and move them around. So pretty cruel. This is one of the things that make these fellas, I think, so extraordinary. Because it's one thing to suggest they might get into trouble. It's another thing to know. And to look at what they could say. God can deliver us. But because God can doesn't mean God will. Now here's a problem that a lot of Christian folks have even today. We assume because God can that God must. And if he doesn't, then he's not God. And how often have we heard people challenge God that way? Well, if he really was there, he would do this. If he really was there, he would do this, that, and every other thing. If God was really there, he'd be a genie in a bottle for me and I'd get unlimited wishes. Oh, he's not in a bottle? Can't really be there. People base God's existence off of his ability to answer their wishes. And not holding ourselves responsible for living up to his word. Now, Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego come in, and of course, King Nebuchadnezzar, part of the problem with Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, for example, under Shadrach, these are their Babylonian names. Because you can't have Christian names in a non-Christian world or Jewish names in a non-Jewish world. I think Hananiah, I think, was Shadrach's name, which meant God is gracious, or Yahweh is gracious. You can't walk around saying Yahweh is gracious when this guy thinks he's the God. So he changes all their names that they're given. He kind of takes this idea of God, of Yahweh being gracious, and he gives it to another God, his God, and says, no, my God, Abed, is gracious. And so they sort of take, and he changes their names. He understands what their Jewish name means. And he just applies the Babylonian God. He substitutes the name of the Babylonian God for theirs. And then, of course, takes the name and puts it into Babylonian. So that the name that we have for Shadrach is this Babylonian God is gracious. And the same thing is true of the other fellows, where who is like God? And so Meshach's name gets changed. And it becomes, it still is, but the God of the Babylonians is substituted. So who is like this Babylonian God? So these guys already had the humiliation of their names being changed. I suppose when they were together, they called themselves by their Hebrew name. But in public, they were given by the king's command these Chaldean names. And so you can imagine how infuriated they must have been that their God was discounted so quickly. Now remember, the ancient idea of God is, if your God is strong, your army will win. That's how they decided religion in the old days. So long as the Jewish army was winning, the Jewish God was big. And remember, before the Babylonians, under David, David was the world emperor. And Solomon came along and he expands the Jewish kingdom. Pretty sizable. At that time, look how strong God was. He was conquering nations, taking over all of their neighbors. And everybody was paying tribute to David. David was taxing half the world, and Solomon was taxing half the world, because they had a strong God. And then the Babylonians come in and beat their God. At least they think that. And he taxes the Jews. In fact, he says, no, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take you completely out of your home. I'm going to take all of you to my house. And your God can't stop me. What he didn't know was that that was God's plan. God's plan was, I raised Nebuchadnezzar up so he would come and take you and carry you off, and then I'm going to leave you there for 70 years, and they're going to let you come back. God's in control of all things all the time. But not everybody can know and see that. And the king, Nebuchadnezzar, definitely did not notice that. So he's thinking he's all powerful. He changes these poor guys' names so that their God isn't even reflected in their name. Well, if he's not in my name, he'll at least be in my life. And I think part of the stance that they took here was that defiant. You can change my name and call me what you want, but you can't change me. You've changed my name. You've changed my location. You've even changed my occupation. But you can't change me. And I think this is really at the heart of all of this. So let's take a look at the good. These three fellas, they've got some good. First of all, they did, now we haven't talked about it yet, but remember when they first were arrested and brought to Babylon? They were good-looking kids. They were royalty back in Babylon. They were princes and things like that. They weren't common paupers. So they had a good diet already. They looked strong. They looked healthy. They were well-groomed and well cared for, well-educated. So when the king was picking out people to represent each nation that he had conquered, he chose these four. And so the king said, listen, I don't like people who don't look real good in front of me. So I want them to exercise, and I want them to eat, and I want them to look well-nourished. It's a campaign. You can't have half-starved people come up and say, I'm a good king. Because half-starved people say, I'm not a good king. So he wanted them to be well-fed. He wanted them to look strong. He wanted them to be educated. He wanted them to be great representatives of him. They would be their ambassador, his ambassador, back to their own people. So he feeds them and clothes them. But the things he wants to eat are not things that Jews are allowed to have. There was probably a shrimp and crab buffet over here. And maybe all the ribs you can eat over there. Now there's a problem. Jews can't eat any shellfish. Jews can't eat any kind of pork. They can't eat anything that has that does not have a hoof on it. And of course, there were camel toes and camel eyeballs and whatever they eat in those days. I don't know. Yeah. And so they couldn't eat all that stuff. They couldn't eat from the king's table. So Daniel says, I'm sorry, but I have to serve my God first. No, you have to serve the king. No, I have to serve my God first. And my God says, I don't eat that kind of stuff. Let me have vegetables and water. No wine. Let me have vegetables and water. And the guy said, listen, you're going to look like malnourished people when I bring you before the king. And then he's going to kill me because you look so poor. Now, tell you what, test us for 10 days. Test us. Let us eat nothing but the fruits, the salad, and the water. And if we don't look good, then we were wrong. And we'll go back and eat what you tell us to eat. All right. So he feeds them what they wanted to be fed. He comes back, and then a few days later, he says, you know what? You guys look better than those fellas over there. You aren't all sort of sloppy looking. You look good. You look healthy. You got nice coloring in your face. You've got your hair, and proper food does a lot for you. And so they get that one. The fella says, okay, tell you what I'll let you do. Since you look so good, king doesn't care what you eat. He just wants you to look good. So you can have, see, they won a small battle, but these three guys stood with Daniel when he said, I wouldn't eat the king's food. They said, we won't either. Changed our name, but he isn't going to change us. And our God says we don't eat that. Simple thing, are you willing to die over what you can and cannot eat? Well, if God told me to, I am. Pretty remarkable fellows. See, here they are unwilling to compromise. So what did that lack of compromise get them? It got them here in the fiery furnace. It was so hot, remember, that when they arrested them and opened the flame, the door to the flame, of course, oxygen would rush in, and so the flame would jump out to get that oxygen, and it cooked the men that were carrying them. As they threw them in, those poor guys died on the spot from the heat of the flame. It's that hot. And so they're in the flame. Strange things are going on. They have no idea yet. They've already said to the king, listen, God can save us. He can. But if he doesn't, and if we die, we will die in obedience to our God. All right, throw him in the fire. On second thought, nope, too late. Throw him in the fire. They didn't compromise. They didn't. You could change my name. You could make me wear what you want. You could feed me what you want. But you can't change me. And so they go in here. Why? Because they weren't willing to compromise. How hard is it to eat some barbecue pork ribs? I got to tell you, I kind of like them myself. I'm not going to go in no flame for, but God never said to me, you can't have barbecued ribs. Now, if God comes down and says, Terry, I'm sorry, you can't eat barbecued ribs, guess what? No barbecued ribs. Now, he could come to me all day long and say, you can't eat crab. I'd never eat crab. I haven't eaten crab my entire life. I've never eaten a lobster. I've never had a shrimp. God could say, no shrimp for you, son. And I could do that, no problem. But if he says no barbecued ribs, I might have me a wee bit of a problem. I'd do it, but I'd be wishing that he'd change his mind all the time. But these guys weren't willing to compromise at all. Not even a little, not even to the king's face. It's one thing when the police tell you to do something. It's another thing when the army tells you to do something. It's completely different when you're standing before the man who could throw you in that fiery furnace. And he's begging you not to go. Don't make me do it. Give me a reason not to make you go. What do you want us to do? I just tell you what, don't even get on your knees. Just kind of bow down a little bit like this. Can't do it. I cannot say that you're God. But the whole world is saying I'm God. I beat your God in the game of war. I've got to be bigger than him because you're my slave. What does that tell you about your God? Well, it tells me that he might not save us. But whether he does or he doesn't, I'm still going to serve him. You're going to serve a God that got defeated? It might look like he got defeated. Maybe he's got a plan and didn't tell me what it was yet. But they wouldn't, whatever his argument was, they wouldn't compromise on it. We are so willing to compromise today. We'd take this old book and throw it out. Probably don't even read it most of the time. Somebody comes by and gives us a new version of it that takes God out of it. All right. They give us a version that says, you know what, Jesus didn't really do any miracles. That's the new standard. If you take out all the miracles and that story about the resurrection, then you can keep your Jesus. Because then it doesn't matter. If you take out the miracles and you take out the resurrection, it doesn't matter what he said. Because he said, here's the proof that what I am saying is true. I'm telling you, you must accept me as your Lord and Savior, and I'm basing it off my ability to raise from the dead. If that didn't happen, he has no authority to ask us to do anything. All of his authority, including the authority that he had with Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, was based on the fact that he was coming someday to die on that cross to raise from the dead. If he didn't die or didn't rise, everything's out the door. There's no authority in this book. All you got to do is show me his body. That's it. You show me those first century Christians who said, guess what? We hid him. And there he is right over there. Not much left. It's all mostly dust and bones, but there's a couple of fragments. You can get some DNA off of it. All right, case closed. Story's over. But when you read the book of Revelation, and Jesus is standing there, it's kind of hard to say he didn't. Because John knew him. John recognized him and fell on his face, because Jesus didn't look like Jesus, the lowly carpenter, anymore. He looked Jesus, the Son of God, high and lifted up. He recognized who he was. He gives us a description of him. And he says, guess what? He's alive. And he's powerful. And he's coming again. And he conquers all of his enemies. We serve God because he is alive. Period. He has the right to save us because he's alive. If he isn't alive, he cannot save. Period. And if he cannot save, then why serve? Because you're going to hell anyway. But he's alive. And nobody has been able to. The Roman Empire could not, with all their vast resources, they could not disprove the resurrection. The Jews, who desperately wanted to, bribed men to say it didn't happen. They don't say it didn't happen. They simply bribe men to say, because they couldn't say it didn't happen. They witnessed it happening. They were there when the soldiers came into them and said, you ain't going to believe this. But up from the grave he arose. Oh, take this money and don't tell anybody that. In fact, tell them that they stole his body. They told them, say this lie, which meant they knew it was a lie. When they said to them, tell everybody this lie instead. That's pretty strong proof. Why would you tell somebody to lie if there wasn't something to lie about? You only lie because there's a reason for it. If there's no reason to lie, you ever tell a lie just because you feel like telling a lie, or is there always some reason to prompt you to lie? Like your mom's about to whoop you, right? And so you got to come up with a good one. People need a prompting to lie. These men were prompted to lie. What was the truth? They all knew the truth. They told them the truth. He's alive. They said, we'll give you money to tell the lie. Doesn't change the truth. Those Romans, those soldiers who were there, he's still alive, but I'll take the money too. It's no skin off my nose, the fact that he's alive. You guys will have to deal with that later. When Paul the Apostle met him, he was alive. When Stephen was being stoned, he was alive. When those disciples who were hiding in the upper room suddenly find themselves out on the streets proclaiming Jesus Christ, he was alive. And Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego knew, all right, he might not save us from the fiery furnace, but he is our God, and we will serve him. And so they do. They weren't willing to compromise, and they survived the fiery furnace, these three guys. In fact, when the king came by and looked into the fiery furnace, he says, didn't I throw three guys in there? Yep. Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego. Then, how come there's four? And that fourth guy looks like a son of God to me. I've never seen him, but if I had to imagine what the Son of God looks like, I'm thinking he looks like that. And so he hollers in, hey, you guys okay? Oh yeah, we're fine. Was the king expecting that? Now, what did the boys tell them, or the men tell them before they were even thrown in? God might, God can save us. And he might. He definitely can. He might not. That part's not in our control. Fortunately for these fellows and for the king, God did save them. They knew that flame was real because they could feel the heat of it. Yet when the men came out, not a hair on their body was singed. You know, I've barbecued in the backyard, and I don't have this big open flame, but sometimes I get close enough to the heat of the thing that it would singe back the hair on my arm. And you can smell it. Oh, that's burnt hair. And that's just a barbecue where I'm searing up some burgers. You can imagine this one right here. Not a hair was singed. Not a thread on their garments was burned. And you know, when you get close to fire, you smell like a fire. There wasn't even the smell of smoke on them. And when the 3 guys came out, only 3 came out. The 4th one disappeared. And the king couldn't explain it. But he knew something special had happened. He knew, and so he says, there is no God like the God of the Hebrews. So he makes a decree that, hey, guess what? You all can bow down to your own God. You don't need to bow down to me. It influenced the king and gave favor to the Jews with him. So looking at these things then, what is this lesson that we might... First of all, isn't it great to have friends when you're in that kind of trouble? True friendship, great friendship is a wonderful thing when you're in that kind of problem. Great strength is found in real friendship. It allowed them, I think they, you know, maybe by themselves, maybe if you're pressured alone and one guy crumbles, it might be easier for the next guy to crumble. But when one guy stands his ground, it makes the second guy, it's easier for him to stand up too. And then the third guy, when he sees his 2 buddies, he's not going to chicken out now. So, see, there's great strength in honest friendship. They didn't want to hurt each other. They were interested in protecting each other. But most of all, listen, if we give in now and we face God, because it's too late, the king's going to kill us. He's got to set an example. We didn't bow down. We're in trouble. But you know what? Let's stick together on this thing. And they did. These, you know, you ever hear one of their names without the other 2 guys? You ever have somebody preach to you on Shadrach? No. It's always Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego. You get the 3 or you don't get anybody. That's how closely they are tied in history. They are tied together by this bond of friendship that strengthened them, encouraged them, and allowed them together to enter the fire. And the great thing about entering the fire is this: they entered into the presence of God. Because Jesus Christ met them in the flame. Jesus isn't going to come for 1,000 more years or better. But these guys get to see what the wise men didn't get to see. They get to see what John the Baptist saw when Jesus came to him. And John recognized, that's the Son of God who takes away the sins of the world. These guys saw him before John did. Because of their friendship, that bond that strengthened them together, what a reward was there for them. Now, it had to be scary when they first opened up that flame and those guys around you die, and it had to be startling. Hey, we're not dead yet. I don't know if they felt the flame, but it didn't burn them. It didn't hurt them because they could have got singed back then. And suddenly you find yourself landing in a flame. And just because there's fire around you, your mind has to be going crazy. You know, it's like when you were a kid and you'd pour lighter fluid on your finger and then you'd light it. Now, it didn't burn so long as the lighter fluid was there, but the fact that your finger was on fire was a creepy thing. It's just the idea that your body's on fire, but you're not feeling it. But it's still there. You could see it. You're looking around. It's at your feet. It's not hurting you yet. But what an uncomfortable. Until Jesus walks in, then all of a sudden they don't notice the flame. They only notice one thing. They notice him. The king noticed one thing when Jesus walked in. They noticed him. And in our lives, when Jesus Christ comes in, what people should see is that they should notice him. Billy Graham was a very, very famous man. But he would always say, I don't want the fame. I want them to look past me and see Jesus. That's what I'm all about. But he couldn't help it. I mean, people, can I have your autograph? He was internationally famous. Couldn't go anywhere and not be recognized. Especially, you heard him talk, you knew that was Billy. But he always wanted to point people to Christ. And so when they look in, he notices these fellows, but his attention is drawn right away to Christ. All of a sudden, guess what? Maybe I'm not as powerful a God as I thought. Because you know what? If me and 3 of my best buddies jumped in that fire, we're all gone. Just saying. Maybe there's something different about them. Maybe there's something different about their God and about their religion. And maybe if people would see us and that our God was different. Maybe our God is a little different. It's important to stand with those that share our convictions. You can't eat that meat. They all stayed together. They backed Daniel up. They stood with him. And it's important when Christianity is under attack, it's important that we stand up. Every now and then I will hear people say foolish things. And I will find myself having to say something. People for no apparent reason like to pick on Christianity. They can't help it. And when they do, I have to, regardless of who the person is, I find myself having to instruct them. Uh-oh, count down. All right, let me change that so I don't lose it. What do I want to say? Oh, wait now. I should be done by then. But we find ourselves, and we have to be willing to. You cannot, when people say something, you cannot just let it slide. That's the problem, no one's standing. There are no Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednegos left. We're all bowing down with everybody else. If we stood up, maybe we too would see God in the flame. The king had to, probably for weeks, wanted to know more about that man who stood in the middle. Because he saw it. He saw God with them. And suppose people should see God with us. The promise of the New Testament is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And if people should see Christ in us, truly see him, so that they don't see us, but they see Christ in us, if they could look beyond us and see the Christ in the middle, maybe they too would be influenced to ask questions about it. Sometimes people at work will say, oh, I know you're a religious man. I'll say, no, I'm not. I don't know where you heard that rumor, but it's not true. I'll say, I'm a Christian man. Oh, what's the difference? I'm glad you asked. And then I have an opportunity to share the gospel with them. I could say, oh, yeah, I'm a religious guy. What? Religious person? Who in the world wants to be known as a religious person? There's a lot of religious people. There's a lot of religions in the world. I am not a religious person. I'm a Christian. That cross goes where I go. And the risen Savior goes with me. And folks need to know that. Like the king, who's that guy in the middle? Who's that makes that influence in your life? I was reminding people today that I was listening and there's an awful lot of cursing and swearing. Now, I didn't say anything. I just withdrew myself away from, and somebody came over and asked me and said, oh, aren't you going to join us? I said, no, you go right ahead. I'm going to stay over here. Oh, how come? I said, well, you're a little too vulgar for me. What? You'd be surprised how many of them claim to be Christians. And I said, here's the problem I have. The Bible says I cannot help but speak the things that I have seen and heard, and I'm hearing way too much. And I'm going to go home and I'm going to see my grandkids, and one of them is going to get me mad. And, Grandpa! And they'll turn, their eyeballs will fall out from shock that I used such a word. I said, I can't let that happen. So the only way I can limit that is not to hear it. Because you cannot help but speak. I said, you realize how come you all swear so much? Because everybody around you swears. And you're only doing what's natural. I said, do you want me to talk like that? Honestly, would it make you comfortable if you heard me talk like you do? Well, no. You're a Christian. You can't. Exactly. So please excuse me if I separate myself. One by one, everybody's come on. They're all apologizing. We're gonna try and do. I said, I don't want you to try and do better, because it doesn't matter to me. If you never cursed another word in your whole life, you'd still go to hell. I said, cursing or not cursing doesn't save you. You have got to accept Jesus. Like I told you, you got to accept Jesus Christ, your personal Lord and Savior, or nothing matters. Because good people go to hell too. That's what the Bible says. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And it gave me an opportunity one more time to share the gospel with them. All we got to do is stand, and hopefully they'll see the man in the middle. And finally, trust God even when you cannot predict. You know, we like to trust God when we know what's going to happen. It's easy to say, I trust God, when you know nothing's going to happen. Or if you know that the prayer has already been answered, it's easy to stand up and say, I trust God. But when you don't know the outcome, He can save us. That much I know, He can. But I don't know if He will or not. That's when faith comes out. I don't know what God's going to do, but I'm going to stand by God anyway. Like Stephen, God could prevent those people from stoning me. He could. But in Stephen's case, He didn't. There's a lot of Christian people. I guess God could have allowed Billy Graham to live to 120. He could. But He didn't. Gave him 99 years. That's a long time. But see, what God can do, and what God might do, and what God ultimately does, you have no control over those last two. All you have is the right to say, I will serve Him. Though He slay me, yet will I serve Him.